The air in Redemption Gulch tasted of grit and failed prayers. Dust, the color of old blood, coated everything, the warped timbers of the general store, the sun-bleached sign of the saloon, and the silent, watchful faces of the townsfolk huddled behind their windows. It was high noon, but the sun offered no warmth, only a bleached, indifferent glare. Inside the First Redemption Bank, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and terror. Caleb was on his knees, hands clasped behind his head, the rough floorboards pressing into his skin. He had come to town for supplies, a rare journey from the solitude of the mountains, and had walked into a nightmare. 3 men, their faces masked by grimy bandanas, moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. 2 herded the terrified cashier and a handful of customers, while the third, the leader, stood watch by the door. He was a specter of calm in the chaos, his eyes the only part of him visible cold gray and utterly devoid of mercy. They were the eyes of a wolf studying sheep. Caleb kept his own eyes down, focusing on a crack in the floorboards, trying to make himself small and visible. He was no lawman, no hero. He was a ghost, a man who had long ago traded the world for the quiet agony of the wilderness. The past was a wound that never healed, and towns like this only salted it. "Hurry it up, Elias." The leader's voice was a low growl, sharp and commanding. The cashier, a young man with a face as white as milk, fumbled with the safe's combination, his hands trembling violently. A sharp crack echoed through the bank as one of the other robbers struck him across the back with a pistol barrel. The boy cried out a thin, choked sound. Caleb's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to stay down, to survive, to return to the mountains where the only dangers were honest ones, like blizzards and bears. But the boy's whimpers scraped at something raw inside him. It sounded too much like his daughter's cry, a memory that haunted his waking hours and owned his dreams. The leader stepped forward, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He moved with a predator's grace, grabbing the cashier by the collar and hauling him to his feet. "One more mistake," he hissed, his voice a blade against the boy's throat, "and your mother will be burying what's left of you." As he shoved the boy back toward the safe, something slipped from the leader's vest pocket. It was small and silver, catching the dusty light as it spun through the air. It landed on the floor with a soft, metallic clink, not 5 feet from where Caleb knelt. Time seemed to slow. The world narrowed to that single point of light on the grimy floor. It was a locket, a small heart-shaped silver locket, etched with a familiar pattern of climbing roses. Caleb's breath caught in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He had buried the only one like it in the world, clasped in the cold, still hands of his wife, Sarah. The safe door creaked open. The robbers stuffed canvas bags with bills and coin, their movements urgent. The leader barked orders, his attention fixed on the street outside. He hadn't noticed his loss. This was his chance. Caleb's mind, long numbed by grief, suddenly blazed with a singular, white-hot purpose. He had to have it. He needed to see it, to touch it, to confirm the impossible truth that was clawing its way up his throat. As the gang backed toward the door, dragging the cashier as a shield, Caleb moved. It was not a conscious decision, but a primal reflex. He lunged forward, his body low to the ground, and snatched the locket. Its metal was cool against his palm, a chilling, solid reality. He scrambled back to his position just as the leader glanced over his shoulder. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, Caleb's wide with a dawning, terrible horror, and the leader's cold and dismissive, seeing only another frightened face in the crowd. Then they were gone, disappearing in a thunder of hoofbeats and a cloud of choking dust. The townsfolk stirred a collective gasp of relief, filling the silence. But Caleb didn't move. He remained on his knees, his head bowed, his world collapsing inward. He slowly uncurled his fingers. There in his palm lay the ghost of his life. The tiny, intricate roses were worn smooth in places, just as Sarah's had been. With a trembling thumb, he pressed the hidden clasp. It sprang open. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was a miniature portrait, not of him and Sarah, but of a woman and child he had never seen. Yet the locket itself was undeniable. It was a perfect twin to the one he had crafted himself, a one-of-a-kind anniversary gift for his wife. The man who had just walked out that door, and the man with the wolf's eyes, was connected to the darkest day of his life. The day his family was murdered. The day raiders had burned his homestead to the ground, leaving him for dead in the ashes. He had believed it was a random, senseless act of violence. He had believed he had failed to protect them. For 5 years, that failure had been his only companion in the vast, empty mountains. But this locket, it changed everything. It was not random. That man, that leader, was there. The quest for survival that had defined Caleb's existence was instantly consumed by a far more powerful fire, the quest for vengeance. The ghost in the mountains had found a reason to return to the world of men. He had to find that man. He had to know the truth. And then he would deliver justice. Sheriff Miller's heavy footsteps were approaching. Everyone stay put. I need statements from all of you. Caleb couldn't stay. He couldn't answer questions. He couldn't explain the silver heart he now clutched in his fist, as if it were his own. Slipping through the stunned crowd, he melted out the back door and into the alley, his long, weary journey toward oblivion suddenly given a dark and terrible direction. He was no longer just running from the past. He was hunting it. The dust of Redemption Gulch clung to Caleb as he fled a gritty shroud for the ghosts that now walked beside him. He pushed his horse hard, not out of fear of the sheriff, but from the urgent, burning need to put distance between himself and the town that had resurrected his personal hell. He needed a place to disappear, a quiet corner of the world, where he could think, plan, and listen. Whispers and rumors were the currency of the West. And he had heard one in a trapper's camp weeks ago, a story of a secluded, sprawling ranch north of the Laramie Range, run by a widow who kept to herself. The Hayes Ranch. It was said to be remote, struggling. And its owner, a woman named Evelyn Hayes, was fiercely protective of her privacy. It sounded perfect. A place to lie low to work with his hands, while his mind worked on the puzzle of the silver locket. The gang had been too organized, too confident. They were local, he was sure of it. And from the Hayes Ranch, he could watch, listen, and wait for the wolf to show himself again. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hayes stood on the porch of her ranch house, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vast, unforgiving expanse of Wyoming. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, whipped strands of raven hair from the tight bun at her nape. She held a rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth by her grip, and surveyed her domain. It was less an empire and more a kingdom under siege. Every fence post her late husband Thomas had driven into the soil, every head of cattle that bore his brand, was a testament to a dream she now fought to defend alone. Her loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that the wind seemed to find and fill with its desolate song. But she had learned to mistake that loneliness for strength to build walls of solitude around a heart bruised by loss. She trusted the land, her rifle, and the calloused resolve of her own 2 hands. Men, she had learned, were a far more treacherous territory. Especially men like Vincent Thorne. He was a recent arrival in the territory, a businessman from the East with a charismatic smile, impeccably tailored suits, and an insatiable appetite for land. He had approached her 3 times now, his offers to buy her ranch escalating from generous to almost desperate. He spoke of progress, of bringing investment to the valley, but his eyes held a predatory gleam that belied his smooth words. He wanted her land, and Evelyn suspected it wasn't for the grazing. The ranch bordered a deep, impassable canyon, and its only reliable water source was the creek that flowed through her property. Control the water, and you control the valley. That evening, she was hunched over her husband's ledger in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, the numbers swimming before her tired eyes. The accounts were a grim tally of dwindling savings and rising debts. The last 2 winters had been harsh, and she was short-handed. She needed help, but the kind of men who drifted through this territory were often more trouble than they were worth. A rifle was always within arm's reach, a silent companion in the quiet house. She was strong, she was determined. But as the night deepened, she allowed herself a flicker of despair. She was so terribly alone. Caleb arrived 2 days later, a wraith emerging from the shimmering heat of the prairie. He was just a speck on the horizon at first, then a slow, trudging figure leading a tired-looking horse. Evelyn watched him from the porch, her hand instinctively going to the rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't make for the house directly, but headed toward the creek, where a section of fence was down, and a handful of her cattle were placidly wandering onto the open range. As he drew closer, Evelyn saw 2 other men on horseback already there. They weren't her men. They were Hank and Jeb, 2 of Vincent Thorne's hired thugs. They weren't fixing the fence. They were leisurely knocking down another section, their laughter carrying on the wind. It was a message clear and simple. Evelyn's face hardened. She was about to shoulder her rifle and march down there herself when Caleb intervened. He didn't shout or draw a weapon. He simply dismounted and walked toward them. His movements unhurried, but radiating a quiet, formidable presence. He was a big man, his frame lean but powerful from a life lived outdoors. "This is private property." Caleb's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it carried. Hank, a burly man with a perpetually sneering face, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boots. "Well, look what the wind blew in. You the new help, old man." Caleb ignored the jibe. His gaze was fixed on the tools in Hank's saddlebag. Man who carries fence-mending tools ought to know how to use them. That fence looks like it needs mending, not breaking. Jeb chuckled a nasty grating sound. "Maybe we like it broken. Gives the cows some room to roam." Caleb took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Hank's. He didn't raise his voice, but a chilling stillness came over him. "This is Mrs. Hayes's land. The cattle stay on it. You and your friend are leaving it. Now." There was something in his tone, a complete lack of fear, combined with an absolute certainty that gave the 2 thugs pause. They were used to bluster and threats to men they could easily intimidate. This stranger was different. He was like a block of mountain granite, unmovable and dangerous. Hank looked from Caleb to the ranch house, where Evelyn now stood with her rifle held loosely at her side. He weighed his options and decided this wasn't the fight he was being paid for. "Come on, Jeb," Hank grumbled, swinging his horse around. "We're done here for today." They galloped off, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered questions. Caleb watched them go before turning his attention to the broken fence. He retrieved a hammer and staples from his worn satchel and with an economy of motion began the repair. He worked as if he had done it 1,000 times, his hands sure and steady. Evelyn walked down from the porch, her rifle still in her hand, her expression a mixture of gratitude and deep suspicion. She stopped a few feet away, studying him. His clothes were tattered, and a wild, unkempt beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were clear and direct. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, her voice sharp. Caleb didn't stop his work. He hammered another staple into a post. "Didn't look like you were in a position to refuse it. Who are you?" He finished the section and finally turned to face her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. "Name's Caleb. I'm looking for work. I can herd cattle, fix fences, hunt. I know the land. Evelyn's gaze was unflinching. I don't hire drifters. I'm not drifting, he said simply. I'm stopping. She hesitated. The way he had faced down Thorne's men spoke of a strength she desperately needed. It wasn't the swaggering bravado of a gunslinger, but the quiet competence of a man who understood threats. She was out of options, cornered by debt and by Thorne. This stranger, this Caleb, was a risk, but keeping him here might be a smaller risk than sending him away. The bunkhouse is out back, she said, her tone clipped in all business. 1 week, you'll work for your keep. If you prove yourself, we'll talk wages. If you don't, you're gone by sunrise on the 8th day. No questions. Caleb nodded, a flicker of something relief, maybe gratitude in his eyes. Fair enough, ma'am. He picked up his satchel and the reins of his horse and walked toward the bunkhouse. Evelyn watched him go the rifle, feeling heavy in her hands. She had just hired a stranger who appeared out of nowhere at the precise moment she needed him most. It felt less like a coincidence and more like the first move in a game she didn't understand. A fragile, tense alliance had been formed, born not of kindness, but of mutual desperation. Vincent Thorne did not wait long to escalate his campaign of intimidation. His methods grew more insidious, designed to bleed Evelyn's ranch dry, to break her spirit piece by piece. A week after Caleb's arrival, one of the ranch's 2 wells was found, fouled the water brackish and smelling of chemicals. It was the well that supplied the north pasture, forcing Caleb and Evelyn to spend 2 back-breaking days driving the cattle to the crowded home pasture near the creek. The act was a clear demonstration of power, a reminder that Thorne could poison the very lifeblood of her land at will. Caleb said little, but his eyes missed nothing. He examined the well, noting the faint, oily sheen on the water's surface, and the tracks of 2 horses shod with a distinctive V-bar pattern he had seen on the horses of Thorne's men in town. He didn't share his certainty with Evelyn, not yet. He simply built a new enclosure around the remaining well, reinforcing it against any further tampering. His quiet competence was a balm to Evelyn's frayed nerves, even as his silence about his past kept a wall of mistrust between them. A few nights later, they were awoken by the frantic lowing of cattle. They rushed out into the moonless dark to find that a long stretch of the southern fence line had been cut, the wires snipped clean. A dozen head of cattle had already strayed into the broken hilly country beyond. The financial loss would be crippling. It's Thorne's men. Evelyn set her voice a tight wire of fury and exhaustion. She stared into the darkness, feeling the weight of her helplessness. We'll get them back. Caleb stated, not as a hopeful promise, but as a simple fact. For the next 3 days, they rode together, tracking the scattered herd. It was grueling work. The land was treacherous and the cattle were spooked. But in that shared hardship, the first cracks began to appear in Evelyn's armor. She saw how Caleb read the land, how he could spot a broken twig or a scuffed patch of earth and know which way an animal had gone. He moved through the wilderness not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged to it. He was patient, tireless, and his respect for the animals was evident in the gentle way he soothed them. They spoke little during the day, their energy focused on the task. But at night, they would build a small fire, and the flames pushing back the immense dark loneliness of the plains. She would watch him, his face illuminated by the flickering light, and see the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. He was a man who carried ghosts. She knew the look well. She saw it in her own reflection every morning. "You're good at this," she said one evening, breaking the long silence. "The tracking. You weren't just a ranch hand before, were you?" Caleb poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Lived in the mountains most of my life. You learn to read the signs, or you don't last the winter. She saw an opening, a chance to learn something more about this enigmatic man. What brought you down from them? His expression shuddered. The quiet connection they had shared moments before vanished. Just needed a change of scenery, he said, his tone flat final. The wall was back up. Evelyn felt a sting of disappointment, but she understood. She had her own locked rooms, memories she never revisited. She spoke of her husband Thomas instead. She kept her words careful and guarded, speaking of his ambitions for the ranch, his love for this land. It was safer than speaking of the crushing void his absence had left behind. They found the last of the cattle on the third day, cornered in a small box canyon. As they were driving them home, a small controlled fire broke out in a remote pasture to the east, sending a plume of smoke into the sky. It was another message from Thorn, a demonstration of his reach. They had to leave the herd and ride hard to beat back the flames, their faces smeared with soot, their lungs burning. That night, back at the ranch house, they sat at her kitchen table, too exhausted to speak. Evelyn cleaned and bandaged a burn on Caleb's forearm. Her touch was gentle, professional. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes on her work. "I would have lost them all. The cattle, the pasture, everything." "You're not alone in this fight, ma'am," he replied, his voice low. She looked up, and their eyes met across the table. The formal ma'am felt out of place after all they had been through. A fragile understanding was beginning to form between them, forged in shared labor and common enemies. Her initial suspicion was slowly being replaced by a grudging respect and something more, a flicker of connection she hadn't felt since Thomas died. For Caleb, protecting this ranch and this fiercely independent woman was becoming more than a cover for his own mission. It was becoming a mission in itself. With the immediate threats to the ranch handled, Caleb began to use his position as a base for his true purpose. Every trip to Redemption Gulch for supplies was a reconnaissance mission. He moved quietly through the town, a shadow in dusty clothes, his ears open. The town's sheriff, a weary, overworked man named Miller, was a font of frustrated information. "It's Thorn Miller," told Caleb one afternoon, leaning against a post outside his office. "He's got the whole valley in his pocket. Buys up failing properties, squeezes the ones that won't sell. He's got a dozen men on his payroll, and half of them are wanted in 2 territories. But he's smart. Everything's legal on the surface. No one's willing to testify against him. They're too scared." Caleb listened, absorbing every word. He began to watch Thorn's men, learning their faces, their habits. He noticed one of them, a lanky man named Jeb, had a jagged, puckered scar on his left wrist. Caleb's blood ran cold. He remembered that scar. He had seen it on the hand of the man who had struck the young cashier during the bank robbery. The connection was thin, but it was there. Another time, while loading supplies, he overheard Hank, the other thug from the fence line, telling a story to his cronies. "We had him cornered, and then quick as a flash, the boss was there." Quick as a flash. The simple phrase hit Caleb like a physical blow. It was a favorite saying of his father's, a phrase he himself had used, often a piece of his old life he thought long buried. Had the gang leader picked it up somewhere? Or was it a chilling coincidence? The threads were beginning to weave a pattern, and at its center was Vincent Thorn. Back at the ranch, a tentative peace settled. The acts of sabotage ceased for a time, as if Thorn were waiting to see if his initial campaign had broken Evelyn's will. In this quiet interlude, the bond between Caleb and Evelyn deepened. She began to trust him not just with the work, but with small pieces of her past. One afternoon, she led him to Thomas's old workshop, a small dusty outbuilding he had never entered. The air inside was still and smelled of sawdust and old iron. Tools hung in neat rows on the walls. On a large workbench sat a half-finished project, a complex gear mechanism for a new type of water pump. He was always tinkering. Evelyn said, her voice soft with memory, as she ran a hand over the smooth, planed wood. He believed this land could be more than just a cattle ranch. He was surveying the canyon, thought he could use the creek's power to irrigate the whole North Valley. She paused, her gaze distant. He died in a riding accident, out near the canyon rim. Caleb looked at the intricate plans tacked to the wall, the precise, intelligent handwriting. Thomas Hayes had been a man of vision. He was a smart man, Caleb said. He was too inquisitive for his own good, she replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. A shadow crossed her face, a hint of a darker story beneath the official version of her husband's death. But just as quickly, it was gone. She showed Caleb Thomas's favorite tools, shared stories of his dreams. In sharing her husband's memory with Caleb, she was letting him into a part of her life she had sealed off from the world. Their evenings by the fire became a ritual. The conversations grew longer, more personal. He spoke of the stark beauty of the mountains, the solitude that could either heal a man or break him. He never spoke of a wife or a family, but she could hear the loss in the empty spaces between his words. She in turn spoke of her life before Wyoming, of a family in the East she had left behind to follow a man with a dream. They were two lonely souls orbiting each other cautiously, their shared sense of loss, a silent, powerful gravity pulling them closer. Caleb's secrecy about his true purpose for being there remained a barrier, a truth he couldn't share without shattering the fragile trust they were building. He was living a lie, and the guilt gnawed at him. But the more he came to know Evelyn, the more he saw her strength and her hidden vulnerability, the more his cold quest for vengeance became complicated by a warm, fierce desire to protect her. The lines were blurring. He had come to her ranch seeking a hiding place, but he was starting to feel like he had found a home. Caleb's investigation had reached a stalemate. He knew Thorne's men were involved in the bank robbery, but he had no proof linking Thorne himself to the man with the wolf's eyes. He needed more. His chance came on a cool, overcast afternoon. He was riding the perimeter of the ranch when he spotted Jeb, the man with the scarred wrist, heading not toward Thorne's sprawling property, but east toward the impassable canyons that formed Evelyn's back border. Curiosity overriding caution, Caleb tethered his horse in a copse of aspens and followed on foot. He moved like a ghost through the rock and sagebrush, his mountain-honed skills keeping him hidden. Jeb rode for miles, finally disappearing into a narrow, almost invisible crack in the canyon wall. Caleb waited, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. An hour passed. Then he heard the distant sound of voices and laughter echoing from the crevice. He crept closer, climbing a rock face to get a vantage point. Below him, nestled in a hidden bowl-shaped canyon, was a collection of rough-hewn shacks and a large corral holding 24 horses. It was the gang's hideout. He lay flat on the rock, peering through a tangle of old cedar roots. Perhaps 20 men were scattered around the camp, cleaning weapons, playing cards, drinking. He saw Jeb and Hank, and then he saw him, Vincent Thorne. He was no longer the polished businessman from town. Here he was dressed in practical, dusty range clothes, a gun belt slung low on his hips. He was laughing with his men, but his eyes, even from this distance, were the same cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. They were planning something. Caleb could hear fragments of their conversation drifting up on the wind. The Union Pacific payroll shipment. Crossing Bear Creek Bridge on Friday. 2 guards, maybe 3. It was another robbery bigger and bolder than the one in Redemption Gulch. but that wasn't what made the blood freeze in Caleb's veins. As Thorn turned to issue an order, he pulled something from his pocket. He held it up, and the weak gray light caught the glint of polished silver. The locket. Thorn, or whatever his real name was, flipped it open, stared at it for a moment, and then snapped it shut. It was a casual, thoughtless gesture. But for Caleb, it was a thunderclap that shattered the world. A memory repressed for 5 long years exploded in his mind with searing, agonizing clarity. It was not a dream this time, but a visceral reliving. The smell of smoke and burning pine, the splintering crash of his cabin door, the terrified screams of his wife Sarah and his 6-year-old daughter Lily. He remembered fighting a wild, desperate struggle against shadows in the firelight. He remembered a face illuminated by the flames, twisted in a cruel sneer. The face of the man who now called himself Vincent Thorn. He remembered the man ripping the locket from Sarah's neck as she lay dying. And he remembered the man's name. The other raiders had called him by it. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The pain was so intense, Caleb almost cried out. He pressed his face against the cold stone, gasping for breath, the truth, a physical weight, crushing him. Vincent Thorn was Silas Blackwood, the butcher who had destroyed his life. Suddenly, everything made a terrifying kind of sense. Why did Blackwood want Evelyn's land so desperately? It wasn't for water rights or grazing. It was something else. His old homestead was less than 10 miles from here on the other side of this canyon range. This land, Evelyn's land, was a buffer. Or worse, it held something he needed to conceal. A buried cache of stolen goods, or a grave, Thomas Hayes. Evelyn's inquisitive husband had been surveying this area right before his riding accident. Had he stumbled upon this hideout? Had he discovered Blackwood's true identity? The fight was no longer about a ranch. It was about justice for Thomas Hayes. It was about stopping a violent gang of thieves. But for Caleb, or Jacob, as he was once known, it was about something far more elemental. It was about staring into the eyes of the man who had taken everything from him. The quiet ranch hand was gone, burned away by the fire of a resurrected memory. In his place was a man consumed by a singular, all-powerful need revenge. The wolf had a name, and Jacob was coming for him. Caleb returned to the ranch under the cloak of darkness, but he brought the storm with him. The quiet, steady man Evelyn had come to know was gone. In his place was a stranger with haunted eyes and a terrifying coiled stillness. He moved with a predator's purpose, cleaning his rifle and pistol with a methodical, grim intensity that sent a chill down her spine. The air in the small ranch house, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, was now thick with a silent, simmering rage. He didn't speak a word about where he'd been. When she set a plate of food before him at the kitchen table, he ignored it. He was sharpening a large hunting knife, the scrape of steel on whetstone, a grating, unnerving sound in the quiet room. Caleb, Evelyn finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it? What's happened?" He looked up, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of real fear. The man staring back at her was not the one who had gently cared for her animals and shared quiet stories by the fire. This man's eyes were blazing with a dark fire she didn't recognize. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said, his voice a low growl. His focus had shifted entirely. The fences, the cattle, the ranch, they had all become secondary. His world had narrowed to a single point, Silas Blackwood. But Evelyn wouldn't be dismissed. She had allowed this man into her life, had begun to tear down walls she had spent years building. She had a right to know what demon was now sitting at her table. "Don't you dare say that to me," she said, her own fear giving way to anger. "You bring this this darkness into my home. And you tell me not to worry, I trusted you. What did you find out there? He slammed the knife down on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. You want to know, he demanded, rising to his feet, his large frame seeming to swallow all the light in the room. You really want to know what I found? He strode over to his pack in the corner and rummaged through it, finally pulling out the small silver locket. He threw it on the table. It skidded across the wood and came to rest near her hand. Vincent Thorne, he spat the name like a curse. I saw him with a locket identical to this one. This one belonged to my wife. Evelyn stared at him confused. Your wife? And then it all came pouring out, a torrent of grief and rage, held back for 5 long years. He told her everything. That his name wasn't Caleb, but Jacob. He told her about Sarah and Lily, about the homestead burned to ash. He told her about the raid and the face he had seen in the firelight, the face of Silas Blackwood, the man now masquerading as Vincent Thorne. He killed them. Jacob whispered, his voice finally breaking the sound raw with an agony so profound it made Evelyn's own heart ache. He killed my family. And all this time, I've been living a lie. My being here, it was never just about work. I was hunting him. I followed the trail of rumors from that bank robbery right to your doorstep. Evelyn felt the floor drop out from under her. The man she had come to rely on to care for was a stranger. His gentleness, his quiet strength, was it all an act? She felt a cold, bitter wave of betrayal wash over her. He had used her. He had used her home, her vulnerability, as a staging ground for his own personal war. Her ranch wasn't a sanctuary he was protecting. It was a vantage point. You lied to me, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and fury. Every day you've been here, you've been lying to me. I couldn't tell you, he stammered, the rage in his eyes momentarily replaced by a desperate plea for understanding. At first it was to protect my cover. Then I started to care about you, about this place. I didn't want to bring my ghosts to your door. But you did, she cried, standing up her chair, scraping harshly against the floor. They're here now, Jacob or Caleb or whoever you are. My fight was for this ranch. Your fight is for blood. I won't have it. I won't let you turn my home into a battlefield for your revenge. The emotional rift between them was a chasm, sudden and absolute. She had opened her heart just a crack, and his ghosts had stormed right in. I want you to leave, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Pack your things. I want you gone by morning. Jacob stared at her, his face a mask of anguish. He had found the man who destroyed his past, only to lose the one person who had offered him a glimpse of a future. He had a choice to make. He could ride out after Blackwood, consumed by the single-minded thirst for vengeance that had driven him for years, or he could try to salvage the new life, the new person he had unexpectedly come to cherish. But as he looked at Evelyn's betrayed face, he feared it was already too late. He had brought the storm, and it was about to break over all of them. Jacob stood in the dim light of the bunkhouse, his few belongings already packed in his worn satchel. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. I want you gone by morning. Morning was still an hour away, a pale gray line on the eastern horizon. He was torn. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to ride to Blackwood's Canyon and end it, to satisfy the 5-year-old hunger for vengeance. But the thought of leaving Evelyn alone, of abandoning her to face the monster he had brought to her doorstep, was an agony of its own. His decision was made for him by the wind. It began as a low moan, then rose to a piercing shriek, hurling sand and grit against the thin walls of the bunkhouse. A sandstorm, savage and sudden, was descending upon the valley, turning the pre-dawn world into a maelstrom of blinding, choking dust. And through the rising howl of the wind, he heard it. The distant, unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Too many horses. Blackwood knew. He must have realized he'd been spotted. He was coming not just to silence a witness, but to erase everything the ranch, the woman who owned it, and the ghost from his past who had found him. Jacob burst from the bunkhouse, his rifle in his hand, shouting Evelyn's name. He saw her on the porch rifle, already in hand, her face grim as she stared into the swirling brown haze. The assault began with a volley of gunfire bullets thudding into the log walls of the house, shattering the windows. The siege had begun. They scrambled inside, barricading the door as the world outside dissolved into chaos. The sandstorm was both a curse and a blessing, its thick, roiling clouds providing cover, but also hiding the enemy's numbers and positions. Muzzle flashes appeared like fleeting, angry fireflies in the gloom. "They're trying to surround the house." Jacob yelled over the din of the wind and gunfire. "Stay away from the windows." They took up positions in different rooms, firing back sparingly, making every shot count. The house groaned under the assault splinters flying from the walls. For what felt like an eternity, they were trapped in a desperate, suffocating battle for survival. The storm outside matched by the storm of violence raging around them. During a brief lull in the shooting as Blackwood's men regrouped, Evelyn frantically shoved a heavy wardrobe against a shattered window frame. As it scraped across the floor, one of the legs snagged on a loose floorboard, pulling it up. Beneath it lay a small tin box. Evelyn stared at it, her mind racing. It was Thomas's old strongbox where he kept his most important papers. She had thought it lost. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, nestled among deeds and letters, was a leather-bound journal, her late husband's journal. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the neat, familiar script. The last entries were dated just days before his death. Her breath hitched. Thomas wrote of his surveys near the canyon, of his suspicions about their new neighbor, Vincent Thorne. His story doesn't add up. One entry read, "The man is no businessman. He is something else. Something dangerous." Then the final terrifying entry. "I found it. A hidden camp in the canyon. It's him." The papers from Cheyenne were right. Thorne is Silas Blackwood, leader of the gang that hit the Laramie stage. He killed the old prospector for his claim, but I think he's looking for something else buried on this land, something from a long time ago. I have to get this to the marshal in Fort Laramie. He cannot be allowed to remain here." Evelyn dropped the journal, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Her husband hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. The man who had charmed his way into the valley, who had smiled at her while pressuring her to sell, had killed her husband to protect his secrets. Her doubts, her betrayal, her anger at Jacob, it all vanished, burned away by a clean, cold rage. This was her fight now, too. Her quest for justice was now intertwined with his. She looked at Jacob, her eyes blazing with a new, unshakable resolve. "You were right," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "He killed Thomas." Before Jacob could react, the front door splintered inwards, and one of Blackwood's men lunged into the room. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She raised her shotgun and fired. The roar was deafening in the enclosed space. The fight was no longer at their door, it was inside their home. The battle shifted, a desperate retreat from the house to the relative cover of the large, sturdy barn. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder. Inside the cavernous structure, visibility was reduced to mere feet. The wind howled through the slats in the walls, creating eerie, shifting patterns of light and shadow. Blackwood was there. He stepped out from behind a stall, his face a demonic mask in the swirling dust, the silver locket gleaming on his chest. "Jacob," he sneered, his voice cutting through the storm. I should have made sure you were dead in that fire. A loose end I regret not tying." Jacob's rage, which he had been struggling to control, boiled over. He raised his rifle, his entire being focused on this one man, this specter from his past. But as he did, two of Blackwood's men grabbed Evelyn, pulling her in front of them as a shield. "Kill me, and she dies with me," Blackwood taunted. The moment of truth was upon him. For 5 years he had dreamed of this confrontation, of the moment he would deliver his own brutal justice. But now, faced with the choice, he saw Evelyn's terrified eyes, and his purpose shifted. His raw need for revenge was tempered, superseded by the urgent, overwhelming responsibility to keep her safe. This wasn't just about his past anymore. It was about her future. "Let her go, Blackwood," Jacob said, his voice dangerously calm as he lowered his rifle slightly. What followed was not a simple shootout, but a desperate, chaotic struggle in the near darkness. Jacob used the environment, knocking over barrels and kicking up hay to create diversions. Evelyn, far from a helpless victim, fought back, fiercely stomping on an instep and driving her elbow back into a captor's ribs, breaking free for a precious second. In that second, Jacob acted. He fired not at Blackwood, but at a rope holding a heavy block and tackle above him. The rope snapped, and the heavy gear crashed down, missing Blackwood, but forcing him to dive out of the way, separating him from his men. The final confrontation was personal, brutal, and hand-to-hand in the suffocating dust. It was Jacob against Blackwood, a desperate clash of two men fueled by years of hatred. But Jacob was no longer fighting just for the dead. He was fighting for the living. He was fighting for Evelyn. That clarity gave him strength. As Blackwood lunged with a knife, Jacob used his opponent's momentum against him, disarming him and sending him crashing into a heavy stall door. Dazed, Blackwood scrambled for his pistol, but Evelyn was there first, kicking it away into the hay. Cornered and defeated, Silas Blackwood looked up at the two of them and the ghost he had failed to kill, and the widow he had failed to break, standing together, their faces set with grim determination. His reign of terror was over-defeated not just by Jacob's strength, but by their combined ingenuity and unyielding will to survive. As dawn broke, the sandstorm finally exhausted itself, the wind softening to a mournful whisper. The dust began to settle, revealing a landscape of devastation under a bruised purple sky. The silence that fell over the ranch was profound, broken only by the groans of Blackwood's wounded men. Just as the first rays of sun crested the horizon, a posse led by Sheriff Miller rode into the yard, drawn by the distant echoes of the prolonged gunfight. They took in the scene with grim faces, the bullet-riddled house, the defeated outlaws, being bound by a soot-stained man and woman who looked as though they had walked through hell and back. Miller took Blackwood and his surviving gang members into custody. The weight of the valley's unspoken fear finally lifted. When they were gone, Jacob and Evelyn were left standing alone amidst the wreckage of their home and their lives. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a heavy, somber quiet. Words felt inadequate, intrusive. Without speaking, they moved to the water pump, the one well that had not been poisoned. Jacob worked the handle while Evelyn splashed water on her face, washing away the grime and the gunpowder. He then gently took a clean cloth from her, soaked it, and began to tend to a long, shallow gash on her arm. His touch was careful, gentle. When he was done, she took the cloth from him and tended to a cut on his cheek, her fingers brushing his skin. In these small, silent acts of care, the first threads of their shattered connection began to re-knit. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, its light illuminating the full extent of the damage. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," Jacob said finally, his voice raspy, "for bringing this to you, for the lies." She looked at him, her green eyes clear and steady. The anger and betrayal were gone, replaced by a deep, quiet understanding. My husband's journal said he was going to the marshal the day he died. He knew who Blackwood was. This fight was always coming to my door, Jacob. You just made sure I was ready for it when it arrived. She paused, then added softly, I'm sorry I told you to leave. He managed a small, weary smile. Seems I'm not very good at following orders. They had both been betrayed, by a brutal act of violence, she by a slow-burning deception. But they had also both found the truth. They acknowledged the pain and the loss that had defined their pasts, recognizing that those same tragic histories, in a strange and terrible way, had forged a bond between them that was now unbreakable. They were survivors standing together in the ruins, with the first light of a new day on their faces. Months passed. The seasons turned, and the harsh Wyoming landscape softened into spring. The ranch, once a scene of violent destruction, was slowly being brought back to life. After the capture of Blackwood's notorious gang, the community, finally free from his shadow, rallied around Evelyn and Jacob. Neighbors arrived with lumber and Hammer's food and helping hands. The barn raising was a celebration, a testament to the valley's resilience. Life was returning. The ranch was different now. It was no longer just Evelyn's lonely burden or Jacob's temporary refuge. It was theirs. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, their partnership seamless and unspoken. They were two changed people, their individual griefs lessened by a shared purpose. Jacob was no longer a ghost hiding in the mountains, and Evelyn's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, now echoed freely across the fields. One afternoon, a dust-covered rider delivered an official letter. It was from the office of a U.S. Marshal. It formally cleared Jacob's name of any association with the outlaws and included a substantial reward for his role in dismantling Blackwood's widespread criminal network, which had plagued 3 territories. Without hesitation, Jacob signed the reward over to a fund for rebuilding the town of Redemption Gulch. His past was settled, but his future was here. On a warm evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, Jacob approached Evelyn on the porch. He wasn't holding a ring, but the silver locket. For months it had remained tucked away, a symbol of the grief and vengeance that had once consumed him. Now it felt like the last relic of a life that was no longer his. Come with me, he said softly. They walked in comfortable silence to a small hill overlooking the recovering ranch. The new beams of the barn gleamed in the twilight, and green shoots were pushing up in the fields. At the crest of the hill, a sapling cottonwood tree they had planted together a week prior stood, its young leaves trembling in the breeze. Jacob knelt and, using his hands, dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the sapling. He held the locket for a moment, its silver warm from his touch. Then he looked at Evelyn, his eyes full of a quiet, profound love. He placed the locket into the earth. Together they covered it, burying the symbol of his haunted past. They were not forgetting what they had lost, but planting it, letting the sorrow of yesterday nurture the roots of a new tomorrow. They stood hands clasped and looked out at their home. He didn't speak of marriage, and she didn't speak of forever. Their commitment was not in words, but in the shared labor of their days and the peaceful quiet of their evenings. It was in the way he knew how she took her coffee, and the way she knew the story behind every scar on his hands. A lot of work to do before the first frost, she said, her voice content. He squeezed her hand. We'll get it done, he replied. They stood together, watching the last of the light fade behind the mountains, their future as resilient and full of promise as the land itself.